Title: The Heart of the Forest. Chapter 1: The Awakening. The night was impossibly still. The kind of silence that blankets everything, swallowing up even the faintest sound, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of your own breath. The wind had long stopped, leaving behind only the remnants of its cold breath on the air. It was late, past midnight, and Jake couldn't remember when he had first stepped into the forest, but he knew he was no longer sure of where he was. The trees towered above him, their branches twisting and writhing like something alive. The shadows they cast were unnatural, stretching too far for any real light to reach them. In the stillness, it almost felt like they were watching him. Jake had been walking for hours, or maybe days. Time had lost all meaning the moment he entered the dense woods. The feeling of being lost was nothing new to him. After all, he had been hiking in remote areas for years, both professionally and for the sheer thrill of it. But tonight, something felt different, something darker. He was no stranger to strange places. He had spent weeks navigating the twisting tunnels of ancient caves, spent hours in the abandoned ruins of forgotten towns. But this was different. The forest seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, a heartbeat that vibrated through his very bones. It was as if the ground itself was alive, its roots reaching out to bind him to it, to keep him from ever leaving. As he stumbled through the dense underbrush, he thought back to the message that had led him here, a message posted on a cryptic forum, a dark corner of the internet where thrill seekers and the curious gathered to share their strange experiences. It was a simple message, a warning, a plea for help. It had been posted by someone named Ted, a user who had been chronicling his exploration of a mysterious cave system. The last post had been different from the others. There was fear in Ted's words, a palpable terror that Jake couldn't ignore. Ted had been so close to uncovering something that had terrified him to his core. But then, the posts had stopped. And despite all the warnings, Jake had to know what had happened. He had to see it for himself. He had followed the clues, traced the path Ted had described, and now, standing in the heart of the forest, Jake could feel the pull. He could feel it in the air, in the ground beneath his feet. Something was waiting for him. He could no longer ignore it, as to pull for the mark of the forest. The deeper Jake ventured, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisting in strange, unnatural shapes, as though they were contorting to form a barrier around him. The further he went, the more he could sense that something was wrong. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the shadows grew deeper, as though they were slowly closing in on him. He had been following a trail, Ted's trail, for what felt like hours, but the further he went, the more uncertain the path became. The markings Ted had left, simple scratches on tree bark, had grown more erratic, more frantic, as if Ted himself had been losing his way. Jake paused in front of one of the markings, a strange symbol carved deep into the bark of an ancient tree. It was a crude shape, a jagged line intersected by a series of curved marks. He had seen similar symbols before, but never like this, never so desperate. He couldn't help but feel a creeping unease, an uncomfortable sensation that crawled up his spine like a cold hand. Something in the back of his mind whispered that he should turn back, that the answers he sought were not meant to be found. But he had come too far, and there was no turning back now. With a final glance at the symbol, Jake pressed on, his footfalls muffled by the thick undergrowth. The path twisted in odd, unnatural angles, as though the forest itself was pulling him deeper into its heart. The trees seemed to loom over him, casting long, skeletal shadows that reached toward him like the outstretched hands of some ancient, unseen force. And the silence, it was unbearable. The kind of silence that made his ears ring, the kind that made him feel like something was waiting in the dark, watching him, listening for the slightest sound. Suddenly, a noise broke the stillness, a rustle of leaves in the distance. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, closer. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the rustling grew nearer. Something was coming. He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the darkness, the beam of light cutting through the night like a knife. There was nothing. The forest was still again, the only sound the beating of his own heart in his chest. He forced himself to breathe, to steady his pulse. But the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. He couldn't shake the thought that the forest itself was alive, that it was aware of him, watching his every move. The first encounter. Jake's feet moved on their own, his legs carrying him deeper into the woods, despite every instinct telling him to turn back. The further he went, the more the forest seemed to close in around him, until it felt like the trees were pressing in on him from all sides. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows stretched impossibly long, writhing like snakes in the dim light of his flashlight. Then he saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the distance, just beyond the reach of his light. It was tall, its outline vaguely humanoid, but there was something wrong about it. It was too still, too rigid, as though it were not a living being at all, but a part of the forest itself. Its shape was barely visible, a dark silhouette against the backdrop of twisted trees. Jake's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. He should run. He should turn and flee, but his body refused to obey. He stood frozen, unable to look away from the figure in the distance. For what felt like an eternity, the figure didn't move. Then, slowly, its head tilted toward him. Jake's blood ran cold as he met its gaze. The eyes were not human. They were black, empty voids, like two endless pools of darkness that sucked in all light, all hope. And in that moment, Jake knew, he knew that this thing, whatever it was not from this world. It had no place here, no place in reality. It was a shadow, a distortion, something that belonged to the deepest parts of the earth, something that was far older than the trees around him. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The descent. Jake's pulse hammered in his ears as he stumbled back, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He spun around, desperate to find something familiar, anything to ground him in the world of the living. But the forest was no longer the same. The trees had shifted, their trunks twisting in unnatural ways, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The darkness seemed to stretch and pull, warping the space around him. The whispers returned. Louder now, clearer. Come deeper, they beckoned, their voices soft but filled with an ancient predatory hunger. You are ours now. Jake's legs buckled beneath him, his mind spinning as he collapsed to his knees in the snow. The voices were inside his head now, weaving through his thoughts, twisting them into something unrecognizable. The forest was calling to him, and there was no escape. His flashlight flickered once, then died, leaving him in total darkness. He tried to stand, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the earth sinking away, as if the forest itself was alive, consuming him, pulling him into its depths. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into his very bones, filling him with a deep, unrelenting dread. The whispers grew louder, closer, and in the distance, Jake could hear the unmistakable sound of something moving in the shadows. He was no longer alone. The voices in the dark. Jake stumbled through the snow, his mind a haze of fear and confusion. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly before him, their branches clawing at the sky, their shadows twisting in unnatural patterns. The whispers followed him, growing louder with each step, until they were all he could hear, all he could feel. He couldn't remember how long he had been walking, how far he had traveled, but he knew he was lost, completely lost. The cave that Ted had written about, the mysterious markings, the figure in the woods, they had all led him here, to this place that seemed to exist outside of time, outside of reality. And then, through the shadows, he saw it again. The figure. It was standing just ahead of him, its outline barely visible in the darkness. But this time, it wasn't still. It was moving toward him, slowly, deliberately, its eyes locked onto his. Jake froze, his blood running cold as the figure closed the distance between them. This time, he didn't wait to see what would happen. He turned and ran, pushing through the thick underbrush, desperate to escape, desperate to find the way back. But the forest was no longer just a forest. It was alive, alive with hunger, with memories, with something far older than any living creature. It was pulling him in, closing in around him, its grip tightening with each passing moment. And as he ran, he could hear the whispers behind him, soft and insistent, like a breath in the wind. "Come back," they called. "You belong here." At the forest's heart, Jake's legs gave out, and he fell into the snow, gasping for breath. The darkness was closing in around him, and he could no longer tell if the shadows were just trees or something much worse. He was trapped. There was no escape. He clutched his chest, his heart pounding as the whispers became a chorus of voices, overlapping, until they were all that he could hear. And in that moment, as the forest closed in on him, he understood. The Wendigo was not just a creature. It was the forest itself. He had walked into its heart. And now, there was no leaving. As the darkness took him, he could feel his mind slipping, his consciousness fading into the eternal whispers of the forest, where the shadows would always watch, always hunger. The forest had claimed him, and in its heart he would remain forever. The whispers lingered, a final haunting call. "You belong here, Jack. Welcome home." Chapter 2. The Depths of Silence. The sun had already set when Jake made his way deeper into the forest. The trees around him seemed to close in, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes that resembled gnarled hands reaching for him. His headlamp flickered with every step, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to follow him, whispering secrets he could not understand. The air was thick with moisture, the damp earth beneath his boots sinking slightly with each step, as though the forest was trying to swallow him whole. He had followed the strange markings Ted had left behind, the crude symbols carved into tree trunks that now felt like cryptic invitations, each one pulling him further into this uncharted wilderness. The further he went, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to fade into a hollow, unnatural quiet. There was no rustling of leaves, no chirping of birds, not even the distant howling of wolves or the croak of a frog. Only the soft crunch of his boots in the snow and the occasional creak of the ancient trees. He paused for a moment, glancing around. The air was so still it felt suffocating, like he was in the eye of some great storm. The forest had swallowed every trace of life, leaving only the weight of its silence to press down on him. He turned his gaze upward toward the twisted canopy, the dark limbs of the trees hanging like ominous veils, blocking out what little light remained. And yet, as the shadows grew longer, Jake could swear that something in the darkness moved, something that wasn't quite a tree, something that wasn't quite human. The shadow beyond, shaking the unease from his thoughts, Jake continued on, his flashlight scanning the path ahead. The markings Ted had left were growing fainter, almost as if they were being swallowed by the very forest itself. The further he moved, the less the trail made sense, as if the earth beneath his feet had shifted, hiding the path and confusing his sense of direction. As he moved deeper into the forest, Jake's steps became less confident. The air felt heavier now, thick with a dampness that clung to his skin. His headlamp flickered again, plunging him momentarily into complete darkness. He cursed under his breath and shook the flashlight, hoping to bring back some semblance of light. The beam sputtered back to life, but it was weaker now, like the batteries were already drained. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. A sharp, screeching sound echoed through the trees, a sound so sudden and unnatural that it made Jake freeze. It was a harsh, animalistic cry, raw and guttural, like the cry of something trapped or in pain. It was followed by a low, continuous hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself, deep and unsettling. Jake's eyes darted around, searching for the source, but the forest was silent again. His breath quickened, his heart pounding in his chest as the darkness seemed to swell around him. It wasn't the first time he had heard something unexplainable in the wild, but this felt different. The eerie feeling from earlier, the sensation of being watched, now felt like a full, oppressive weight on his chest. Something was here, something he could not see but could feel in the pit of his stomach. He could no longer deny it. The cry in the distance. Unable to stand still any longer, Jake forced himself forward, pushing through the thickening undergrowth. He had come so far. He couldn't turn back now. He had to see this through, even if it meant walking straight into whatever dark force had claimed Ted. The trail seemed to vanish at times, as though the forest itself was conspiring to erase every sign of Ted's journey. And then, just as Jake's thoughts began to wander toward madness, he found it. In the distance, barely visible through the thick fog that had begun to settle in the forest, Jake saw something unnatural. A shape, a doorway. It was hard to tell. The shadow that loomed ahead of him was massive, standing far taller than any tree. The closer he got, the more the shape seemed to twist, as if it were made of the very shadows of the forest. It was large, but its edges were undefined, as though it existed partially in another dimension, its form shuddering and shifting with each step Jake took closer. Suddenly, the soft hum returned, vibrating through his bones, filling his head. The shadows seemed to press in closer, surrounding him, choking out the light. Jake tried to steady his breath, but his hands trembled violently. The figure in front of him was now unmistakably humanoid, its body stretched out unnaturally, as though it were made of shadows themselves. It was then that Jake realized the truth. This was not a place. This was not a forest. This was something much older, something much more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. This was a threshold, a doorway to something that had been here long before humans had even learned to walk. It was the Wendigo. To the unseen force. Jake's feet stumbled backward as he took in the monstrous form ahead of him, his mind struggling to grasp the reality of what he was seeing. The creature's form loomed larger than life, but it was its eyes that stopped him cold. Hollow, dark voids that seemed to peer deep into his soul. They were so black, so deep, that they absorbed the very light around them, pulling him in. But before Jake could react, the creature's head tilted sharply to the side, the motion disturbingly unnatural, as if it were studying him, evaluating him like an animal preparing to pounce. Its grin spread wider, its mouth widening impossibly, revealing rows upon rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The humming sound in the air grew louder, and suddenly, the world around Jake seemed to shudder. He felt the ground beneath his feet tremble. It was as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to bend, as if the Wendigo's presence was unraveling the laws of nature themselves. His heart raced, his pulse thundering in his ears, and he couldn't move. The Wendigo took a step forward, and the air itself seemed to bend and ripple with its movement. Jake could feel it now, the pull, the force that was drawing him closer, beckoning him forward. He could feel his body responding, his legs unwillingly carrying him closer to the creature, as if his own instincts had been overwhelmed by its dark power. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him, as if they were coming from everywhere at once. "Come closer," they whispered. "Come to the heart. It is waiting." The inescapable hunger. Jake struggled to move, to fight against the overwhelming pull. The Wendigo's eyes were locked on him, unblinking, and the creature began to speak. Not with its mouth, but with its mind. An ancient, powerful voice that filled his skull, vibrating deep within his bones. "You are mine," the voice rumbled, its sound deep and gravelly, as if it came from the very earth itself. "You have wandered too far. You have entered the place where the hunger lives. You cannot leave." Jake's mouth went dry, his mind swirling with panic. He had heard the stories, heard the warnings from Ted's last journal entry. The Wendigo was no legend. It was a force, a being older than time, born of the forest's darkest hunger. It was never just a creature. It was a manifestation of the forest's endless need to consume, to devour. Jake turned to run, but his legs felt like they were made of stone, his body frozen in place. The whispers filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts, suffocating him. "You will stay," the Wendigo's voice continued, softer now, almost soothing. "You will be part of us, forever." The ground beneath him shook again, more violently this time, and the earth began to split open, revealing an abyss that stretched deeper than the world should allow. The Wendigo's silhouette merged with the darkness, and Jake's body was pulled, dragged toward it. The air felt like thick black water, pulling him under, pulling him into its depths. He couldn't breathe. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, but the pressure increased, squeezing the air from his chest, suffocating him with the weight of it. He felt the Wendigo's cold, unnatural presence wash over him, and a terrible, gnawing hunger started to spread inside him, an emptiness that could not be filled. And then he understood. He wasn't just trapped. He was becoming part of the Wendigo, part of the hunger, part of the forest. The forest consumes all. The last thing Jake saw before everything went dark was the forest. The shadows enveloped him completely, consuming him whole, leaving nothing behind. The air became silent again, still as death. When the darkness faded, the Wendigo was gone. But Jake was not alone. His body was still there, his breath shallow, his skin pale as the snow. His mind was fractured, his sense of self splintered into pieces, scattered like leaves in the wind. His eyes, once bright with curiosity and determination, were now hollow, black voids. The Wendigo's hunger had consumed him, as it had consumed so many before. The forest had claimed another soul, adding it to its eternal hunger. In the distance, the wind picked up again, a low, mournful whistle through the trees. The forest was alive once more. And in the silence, there was only the whispers, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into its depths. The Wendigo was eternal, and it was never truly gone. Chapter 3. The Hollow Echo. Jake had lost track of time. Whether it was minutes, hours, or days, he couldn't be sure. The further he ventured into the forest, the more it seemed to stretch and distort around him. The trees, which had once been sturdy and resolute, now appeared to bend, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that blocked the faint moonlight. It was as though the forest was alive, breathing, its very core shifting with every passing moment. Each step he took felt like an eternity, and yet the trees around him, the dark shadows, seemed to remain unchanged. The air had grown damp, and there was a pervasive cold that gnawed at his skin, sinking deeper into his bones with every movement. His flashlight flickered, casting elongated shadows on the ground before him. The shadows, however, weren't entirely still. They seemed to shift slightly, like something was moving just beyond the reach of the light. Something watching him. He stopped abruptly, breathless, his pulse quickening. The forest had swallowed him completely. He had strayed from the path that Ted had left behind, the strange symbols carved into the trees, the signs of his journey. Everything had faded into the thick fog that seemed to have descended from nowhere. The world had become suffocatingly quiet, as though the trees had locked him in, cut him off from the outside world. Was he still in the same place? Jake couldn't tell anymore. The dense undergrowth was different now, more oppressive. His footing had become unstable, the earth beneath him soft and uneven. As he ventured forward, his thoughts wandered back to the strange encounter he had earlier, when he thought he'd seen something that wasn't entirely human, not entirely of this world. The shadows, the dark figure with hollow eyes. It had felt like a warning. Something ancient was watching him, something that did not belong to this place. And then the whispers began. The whispers return. At first, Jake thought it was the wind, the subtle rustling of the trees. But no, the sound was different. It was deliberate, too soft to be a natural occurrence, too deliberate to be ignored. A faint murmur drifted through the trees, so soft that it was almost imperceptible, like a voice carried on the wind. It sounded like a name. Jake. His breath caught in his throat. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was soft, too soft, almost as if it was a mere thought, an echo within his mind. He tried to shake it off, convincing himself it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on him. But then came another whisper. Jake, come closer. It was so soft that it didn't feel like words at all. It was more like a tug, a pressure against his mind, pulling him deeper into the forest. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, to turn back, but his legs felt heavy, as if the forest itself was slowing him down, weighing him with an unseen force. A sharp breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and the whispers stopped, but the silence left behind felt worse. The hollow clearing. He moved on, hoping to escape the eerie feeling creeping up on him, but the forest refused to give way. The trees became more closely packed, their roots twisting underfoot, tripping him as he made his way forward. The darkness around him thickened with each step he took, the trees casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to stretch toward him, like reaching hands. Eventually, the dense trees began to thin, and Jake found himself in a small clearing. He blinked as the moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting pale beams onto the forest floor. The clearing should have been a relief, a sign of open space, but it only filled him with an uneasy sense of dread. The air felt heavier here, thick with the scent of decay. The ground was littered with dead leaves, their brown, brittle forms crushed underfoot. The center of the clearing was unnaturally bare, devoid of life or growth, as if the earth itself refused to let anything live there. The silence was absolute. Jake felt as though the very earth was holding its breath, waiting for something he couldn't name. He walked toward the center of the clearing, his every step muted by the thick, suffocating silence. His flashlight flickered again, the beam wavering as if struggling against something unseen. That's when he noticed it. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stone, each rock carefully arranged in a pattern that appeared too perfect to be natural. The stones were worn, their edges rounded by time, but they still stood tall and deliberate, encircling the heart of the clearing. A low, insistent hum vibrated through the ground beneath him, filling his body with a low buzz that made his skin prickle. The whispering voices started again, louder now, echoing through the trees, reverberating within the very stones themselves. It's too late. Come closer. Jake's breath quickened. He felt paralyzed, like his body had betrayed him. He had come this far, but the pull of the stones, the pull of the clearing, was undeniable. His hand reached forward, instinctively moving toward the center of the circle, but just as his fingers brushed the edge of one of the stones, a loud snap broke through the air. A branch above him cracked, followed by a rush of wind that seemed to materialize from nowhere. It was then that he saw it. The figure in the shadows standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, where the shadows gathered in a thick veil, was a figure. At first, Jake thought it was another illusion, a trick of the dark, but as he squinted, his heart stopped. The figure was too still, too deliberate in its stance. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and it was watching him. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its form blending seamlessly with the surrounding forest. Its head was tilted slightly, its body rigid and unmoving, like a predator assessing its prey. Its eyes, Jake realized, were the most terrifying part. Two bright, unnatural yellow eyes glowed from the shadows, pinning him in place, locking him into a trance of fear. He couldn't look away. The figure was not human. It wasn't anything he had ever seen before. The whispers grew louder, now an unintelligible cacophony that rattled his brain, making his head throb with pain. It was closer now, within the perimeter of the clearing, its movements slow and deliberate as it took a step forward. "Leave now!" The voice didn't come from the figure. It wasn't even a voice at all. It was in his mind, one final, urgent thought, a desperate command that reverberated in his skull, a command that filled him with terror. But Jake was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure was coming closer, its presence suffocating, closing in on him with every step. Each movement was fluid, too fluid, its limbs shifting unnaturally as though it were not entirely bound to the earth. The figure stopped a few feet from him. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. Then the figure lifted one long arm, and Jake's breath hitched. The figure pointed directly at him, and then it spoke. "Come," it said, the voice cold, not a whisper, but a deep, bone-chilling growl that reverberated through the very air. "Come to the heart of the forest." At the heart of the forest, Jake's body finally obeyed. His legs moved against his will, as though they were being pulled by some invisible force. His heart was racing, the blood pounding in his temples as he approached the figure that now seemed to tower over him, its form growing larger with every step. It beckoned him forward, its elongated fingers stretching toward him like the branches of the trees around them. With every step, the forest seemed to grow quieter, more suffocating. The air was thicker now, more oppressive, until it felt as though the very earth had become alive, shifting beneath his feet. He wanted to scream, to run, but the words were lodged in his throat, suffocating him as surely as the whispers that continued to spiral around him. His body was moving toward the figure like a marionette pulled by strings. The clearing began to twist, the ground beneath him sinking, warping. The stones in the circle began to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light. The air itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm, as if the very heart of the forest was beating in time with the darkness that had consumed him. And then, as Jake's feet crossed the threshold of the circle, something shifted. The ground beneath him cracked open, revealing a darkness so profound, so consuming, that it seemed to swallow the light. The figure stepped forward, its eyes fixed on him, unblinking, and then the world went black. Of the unseen realm, when Jake opened his eyes again, the world had changed. The trees, the shadows, the figure, everything was gone. He was no longer in the clearing, no longer surrounded by the oppressive weight of the forest. Instead, he stood in an open space, surrounded by an endless void. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, like the calm before the storm. There was no sound, no wind, no birds, only the hollow echo of his own breath. And then, from the darkness, a shape emerged. It was the Wendigo, no longer a figure in the shadows, but a full, terrifying presence. Its eyes glowed with hunger, and the air itself seemed to warp around it, as though the creature was a tear in reality itself. It was the heart of the forest. Jake understood now. The Wendigo was not just a beast. It was the hunger, the insatiable void that devoured all who dared to come close. The forest had no boundaries, no limits. It was alive, and it would claim him, as it had claimed Ted, and every other soul foolish enough to wander into its depths. Jake's knees buckled beneath him as the darkness closed in. The Wendigo's laughter echoed through the void, deep and guttural, reverberating in his bones. And in that moment, Jake realized there was no escaping the hunger. There never had been. Chapter 4. The Descent. Jake's body was on autopilot. He moved through the forest, his legs carrying him deeper into the dark heart of the wilderness, despite the raw terror clawing at his chest. Each step felt like he was sinking into the earth itself, the soil pulling at his boots, as if the ground were trying to claim him, to drag him into whatever unknown depths it hid beneath its roots. The forest had grown heavier around him, the trees now pressing in, their twisted limbs seeming to reach for him like skeletal fingers, hungry and cold. He couldn't remember how long it had been since he had entered this cursed place. The hours bled together in a mess of confusion and terror, each moment blending into the next. The light had started to fade hours ago, and the heavy shadows of the trees were beginning to stretch unnaturally long, as though the forest itself was growing, suffocating, consuming the last remnants of daylight. The air felt different now, thicker, colder, as if it were pulling at his lungs, weighing them down, making each breath a laborious task. The whispers from before had not stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, more insistent, filling the space around him like a constant hum. He could feel the voices pressing against his skull, like fingers poking at the edges of his mind, urging him to listen, urging him to obey. And though he tried to fight it, to shut them out, their call was too strong. The whispers were no longer just a soft sound. They had become an insidious force, an undeniable presence that flooded his thoughts. "Come deeper, Jake. You are one of us. Come closer." His stomach churned, nausea creeping up his throat as the forest seemed to close in around him. His legs trembled with every step, but he could not stop. He had to keep moving forward. He had to keep walking deeper into the forest, into the void that had swallowed Ted, that had taken so many others before him. The hollow path. The forest had changed since his first steps. It wasn't the same place anymore. The trees that had once seemed like silent sentinels were now twisted, gnarled, their bark warped and darkened as if something had been feeding on them. The shadows beneath their branches were thick, heavy, like the air itself was a living thing, creeping and slithering around him, seeping into his skin. The once familiar trail was gone, replaced by a winding path that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. He looked around for some sign of Ted's markings, the cryptic symbols that had led him this far. But the symbols were now gone, replaced by strange, jagged etchings in the trees, carvings that were crude, almost primal, like something had scraped them into the bark with desperation. The markings seemed to grow darker the further he went, the lines jagged and deep, almost as if they were bleeding, as if the forest itself was writing something, writing its story in blood. Jake's pulse quickened, and he felt a flicker of panic rising in his chest. The path was narrowing, the trees now leaning so close together that he had to duck beneath the thick branches. The air had grown colder still, biting at his skin, and the eerie silence pressed in on him from all sides, making it harder to breathe. And then, through the suffocating silence, he heard it again, the scraping sound. It was subtle at first, distant, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was as if something, or someone, was dragging across the ground, scraping against the earth with slow, deliberate movements. The sound was too rhythmic, too purposeful to be natural. He froze in place, his heart hammering in his chest as he strained to listen, his breath shallow in the thickening air. The sound grew closer. He turned around, his flashlight beam sweeping the dark woods, but all he saw were the shadows, deep, shifting shapes that seemed to stretch toward him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Jake stood there, his breath held in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to move, to turn and run, but his body refused to listen. It was as if the forest itself had gripped him, held him in place. And then he heard it, the whisper again, but this time it was not in his mind. It was a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably real. "Come closer. It's almost time." He flinched, the words vibrating through his body, and before he could react, his legs were already moving. His feet carried him forward, through the thickening trees, past the crooked limbs, past the silent shadows that watched him from the dark corners of the forest. At the pit, Jake stumbled forward, each step now a struggle. The whispering voices had intensified, swirling around him like an invisible storm, their words blending together into an incomprehensible chant that filled his mind with a sense of unease so overwhelming he could barely think. It was all he could do to keep moving, to press on, even as every part of him screamed to stop, to turn around, to leave this nightmare behind. He came upon the clearing without realizing it, the dense trees suddenly giving way to a wide, open space. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the ground. In the center of the clearing stood a pit. It was impossibly deep, the blackness within it absolute, as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed whatever lay beneath. The walls of the pit were jagged, uneven, but they seemed to pulse, to breathe. It was as if the ground itself was alive, shifting and moving beneath his feet. A low rumble reverberated through the air, vibrating in his chest, as though the pit were calling to him, drawing him in. Jake stumbled closer, his foot slipping on the loose earth. The edges of the pit seemed to warp as he approached, the shadows deepening around its edges. He could feel the cold air rising from it, thick with the scent of decay, like the smell of something rotting deep beneath the earth. "Come closer, Jake." The voice was louder now, more distinct. It felt like it was coming from the pit itself. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping with every breath he took. His mind was clouded, filled with a single, desperate thought. He had to look inside. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't even a decision. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him to the edge of the pit. He bent down, peering into the darkness below. The beam of his flashlight flickered once more, casting a pale light on the edges of the hole. For a moment, he saw nothing. And then, in the depths of the pit, he saw them. Eyes. Thousands of eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, reflecting the light of his flashlight like a swarm of insects. They were everywhere, eyes upon eyes, endless, all staring up at him with a hunger so deep, so ancient, that it made his stomach churn. Before he could react, the ground beneath him gave way. His foot slipped, and with a horrifying, gut-wrenching sensation, he found himself falling. The abyss. He fell for what felt like hours, the darkness swallowing him whole. The earth around him seemed to stretch, warping, as if the pit itself was a living thing, pulling him into its very depths. His hands scrambled for purchase, but there was nothing to hold on to. The walls of the pit were slick with something thick and dark, like tar or blood, and with every frantic movement, he sank deeper, his body slipping farther into the void. The whispering voices surrounded him now, echoing in his mind, feeding on his fear. The words were indistinct at first, but soon they began to form shapes, to make sense. You cannot escape. You never will. The air around him was thick with the smell of decay, the heavy metallic scent of blood and rot. He could hear something moving in the darkness, something scratching, dragging itself across the stone, crawling toward him with a relentless hunger. He reached out, his fingers grazing the walls, but they met only the soft, wet texture of something alive, something that pulsed beneath his touch. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. The pit had become his world now, a place of endless hunger, a place where the shadows thrived and fed on his very soul. And then he felt it, the sharp, cold touch of something crawling up his back, its claws digging into his skin. He tried to jerk away, but the darkness tightened around him, squeezing, pressing, until his body could no longer move. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they filled his skull completely, until they became one single unified scream. You are ours now. The endless fall. Jake's body jerked violently, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, but there was no air to breathe. His lungs burned, his vision blurred as the darkness wrapped around him, pressing in tighter, until there was nothing left but the sound of his own heart beating in his chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it all went silent. The darkness was absolute, an impenetrable void that swallowed everything. Jake's thoughts were a haze, a mess of fear and confusion. Was he still falling? Was this the end? Or had he been claimed by the abyss, by the forest that had long since ceased to be a place of nature and become a realm of hunger? He closed his eyes, knowing there would be no escape. The Wendigo had waited for him. The hunger had claimed him, and the forest would never let him go. The last thing he heard was the faint echo of the voices, whispering in his mind, "You belong here." And then, the silence was complete. Chapter 5. The Heartbeat of the Forest. Jake's consciousness swirled in and out, his mind trapped between waking and dreaming. The last thing he remembered was the fall, the abyss swallowing him whole, the darkness closing in. But now, he felt as though he were drifting, floating in an empty space, caught in a cold and weightless void. The air was thick, like smoke, but he couldn't breathe. His lungs burned, each breath a struggle, yet there was no air to fill them. The voices were still there, whispering from a distance, faint murmurs just beyond his understanding, their words slipping in and out of focus like the fleeting shadows that darted across the edges of his vision. They spoke of hunger. They spoke of waiting. Come closer. The words wrapped around his thoughts, suffocating them, pulling him back toward the forest, back toward the place he couldn't escape. His pulse quickened, his body aching with the familiar, unrelenting hunger that gnawed at him from within. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by unseen chains. His fingers twitched, his legs stiffened, but nothing responded. His body was no longer his own. There was only the heartbeat. It echoed through the void, slow at first, distant, but growing louder. It was deep, primal, a low thrum that vibrated in the very air around him. It wasn't just a sound. It was a force, a pulse, an entity. Come closer, the voices repeated, their tone coaxing, gentle, as if inviting him into their eternal embrace. He tried to scream, but the words never reached his mouth. He couldn't remember how to speak. All he could hear was the heartbeat, and with it, the sensation of being pulled, as if by invisible tendrils wrapped around his soul, drawing him deeper into the darkness. The awakening. Suddenly, the emptiness shattered. Jake gasped, his eyes flying open, his body jerking forward in one violent motion. He was on his knees, gasping for air, the raw, sharp scent of earth and decay filling his lungs. His vision was blurred at first, but it cleared quickly as he sat up, his head spinning, his pulse racing in his temples. His mouth was dry and his skin felt clammy, the cold sweat sticking to his clothes. He was back in the forest, but it wasn't the same place. Everything had changed. The trees around him were taller now, their trunks thick and gnarled, twisting up into the dark sky like ancient sentinels guarding the unknown. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, bending and writhing, as though they were alive, moving with a purpose, following him. Jake slowly pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky beneath him, his body weak from the fall and the confusion. He wiped his forehead, his hand coming away slick with sweat, his heart still pounding in his chest. But there was something else, a deep pulsing hum that vibrated through his bones. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but as he looked around, he realized it was everywhere. The heartbeat. It was coming from the trees, from the earth, from the very air he breathed. It was alive. The path of shadows. The trees around him seemed to shift as he moved, their branches stretching out like fingers, casting strange, sharp shadows that seemed to grow and shrink with every step he took. The ground beneath him was soft, the soil damp and uneven, and every step was a struggle, as though the earth itself were working against him. He stumbled forward, pushing through the thick undergrowth, his breath shallow and ragged, his mind racing with 1,000 questions he couldn't answer. Why was he here? What had happened? Was this still the same forest he had been walking through before? He couldn't remember. The whispers had stopped, but the heartbeat, the thrum, was still there, louder now, filling the air like a constant presence. It was like the forest was alive, breathing, pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. And in the distance he saw it, a figure. It was standing at the edge of a clearing, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. At first it was just a shape, a shadow among the trees, but as Jake got closer, it became clearer. A person. A man. Ted. Ted's message. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure how, but he knew it was Ted. It had to be. He called out to him, his voice weak and ragged, but it carried through the air. The figure didn't respond, but as Jake approached, the man turned toward him. His face was pale, gaunt, and his eyes, Jake's breath caught in his throat as he looked into those hollow, sunken eyes. There was nothing there. No life, no recognition, only emptiness. Ted stood motionless, his body stiff, his arms at his sides, as though he were waiting for something, waiting for Jake. Jake took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out, but just as his fingers brushed against Ted's arm, the man's eyes snapped open, wide and unblinking, locking onto Jake with a terrible, unfathomable gaze. And then Ted spoke. "You're too late. It's already inside you." The words were cold, detached, and they hit Jake like a physical blow. His mind reeled, unable to comprehend. What did he mean? What was inside him? Ted's gaze softened, his features shifting in a way that didn't seem natural. His mouth curled into a faint, empty smile, one that was more a grimace than anything else. "You can't escape. You never could." Before Jake could respond, Ted's body jerked, his arms stretching out unnaturally, his fingers snapping open and closed like a marionette being manipulated by invisible strings. His body spasmed, twisting in ways that were impossible, his back arching unnaturally as he dropped to his knees, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The forest around them seemed to react. Shadows deepened. The trees groaned and creaked. The very earth shook beneath Jake's feet, as if the ground itself was responding to Ted's torment. Jake took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest as he watched, paralyzed. The whispering had returned, faint at first, but it grew louder, filling his ears, burrowing into his mind. The voices spoke in unison now, chanting, singing, calling for him. He couldn't move. His body was frozen, his mind overwhelmed with the horror unfolding before him. Ted's body went still, and for a moment everything was silent. Then, Ted's head snapped to the side with a sickening crack, and his eyes fixed on Jake once more. "It's here." Ted rasped, his voice now low and guttural, as though something deep within him had taken control. It's always been here, and now it's awake. The ground beneath them trembled again, and the trees began to shift, their branches groaning as if something was moving beneath the roots. Jake's vision blurred, and he stumbled backward, his body heavy with terror. The heartbeat. It was louder now, deafening. "Come," Ted whispered, his voice twisted, as though it came from somewhere deep in the earth. "You've been chosen." At the heart of the forest, suddenly, the trees parted, revealing something in the center of the clearing. A large stone altar, covered in strange cryptic symbols that pulsed with an eerie glow. The markings on the stone were not carved but seemed to shift, constantly changing, as if they were alive. And in the center of the altar was a pool of liquid, black as oil, reflecting nothing but the forest around it. Jake's mind screamed at him to turn and run, but his body was no longer his own. He was being pulled forward, drawn toward the altar, toward the darkness at its center. The whispers grew louder, their words now clear, filled with urgency. "Come closer. Join us." Jake's feet moved against his will, his legs carrying him toward the stone, his body obeying the call, the command, as if he were already part of it. He had been chosen. There was no escaping. As his fingers brushed against the edge of the altar, the world shifted. The heartbeat became a roar. The trees shook violently, their branches snapping and splintering as though something immense was pushing through them. The earth cracked open, and from the darkness beneath, a shadow rose. Jake's heart nearly stopped as the shape emerged. A towering figure of darkness, its limbs twisted and long, its form formless, just a mass of shifting shadows. Its eyes glowed like molten gold, piercing the darkness with their gaze, and its mouth opened in a silent, endless scream. The Wendigo. It was here. And Jake knew, he had always known, that it had been waiting for him. Shiksats. The final choice. The Wendigo's presence was suffocating, its hunger palpable in the air, in the earth, in the very shadows around them. Jake could feel it inside him, crawling beneath his skin, gnawing at his soul. He tried to scream, but the words stuck in his throat. The Wendigo was not just a creature, it was the forest, the earth, the hunger of the land itself, and it had claimed him. There was no escape. The Wendigo's eyes locked onto his, and Jake felt his body move once more, this time willingly, as though he were a puppet being drawn toward it. He stepped forward, one step at a time, toward the darkness, toward the creature that was waiting to consume him. And as the darkness closed in, Jake understood. He was already part of it. The hunger had already claimed him. The last thing he heard was the echo of the heartbeat, and he knew he would never leave the forest. Chapter 6. The Eternal Hunger. Jake's eyes snapped open, but the world around him seemed to be completely unfamiliar. He was no longer standing at the altar, no longer surrounded by the twisting trees and shadows. Instead, he was lying on a cold stone floor, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. His limbs felt heavy, as if they had been weighed down with centuries of dust. His breath came in shallow, rapid gasps, his body trembling with a coldness that seemed to seep into his very bones. The shadows in the corners of his vision seemed to stretch and writhe, but his eyes couldn't focus. Not yet. His mind was clouded, still reeling from the horrors of the Wendigo's presence, the abyss that had swallowed him whole. Had it been real? He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness slammed into him. He clutched his head, trying to clear the fog, but it only grew thicker. The heartbeat, that deep, resonating pulse, still echoed through his mind, reverberating in his skull, louder now, pressing against his thoughts like an iron weight. He tried to steady himself, his hand brushing against the cold stone beneath him. The surface was rough and uneven, slick with moisture. As he attempted to push himself up, his fingers brushed against something sharp, something metallic. It was an old rusted chain, wrapped tightly around the stone. He followed the chain with his eyes, his gaze tracing it back to its source, another chain that anchored him to the very ground. The pit in his stomach grew deeper, heavier, as the realization set in. He was trapped. The Forgotten Room. Jake's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and terror. His memories, once so clear, were now scattered like fragments of a shattered mirror. He couldn't remember how he had gotten here, or what had happened in the moments before, but he could feel the weight of the Wendigo's hunger pressing down on him. He could feel its presence, that insatiable void that consumed everything in its path. His breath quickened as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The room, if it could even be called that, was small, confined, and claustrophobic. The walls were damp and uneven, covered in layers of grime and moss. The only light came from a flickering, dying torch mounted in the corner, casting long, jittery shadows that danced across the walls like the twisted limbs of unseen creatures. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot, the scent of a place long forgotten by time. The chains around his arms were heavy, rusted and tight. They dug into his skin, biting at his flesh with a cold, unforgiving grip. He struggled against them, but the more he fought, the more they seemed to pull tighter, pulling him closer to the stone floor, to the darkness beneath him. The pressure of the Wendigo's hunger grew stronger, a relentless force that made him feel as though the very earth itself was closing in on him. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper. His thoughts were fragmented, slipping away like sand through his fingers. But amid the confusion, one thought remained clear. The Wendigo had claimed him. The walls of the room seemed to move, shifting and warping around him, the very foundation groaning with the weight of time. And then, as if the darkness itself had heard his thoughts, a figure appeared in the corner of the room. It was tall, its form barely visible in the dim light, but Jake could feel its presence, its eyes boring into him, watching him. The hollow gaze. Jake's body went still, his pulse racing, as the figure stepped closer. His breath caught in his throat as it moved with a strange, unnatural grace, its limbs elongated, its body twisting and shifting in a way that defied human anatomy. It wasn't human, not entirely. The creature's form was draped in shadows, its face hidden behind a veil of darkness. But its eyes, they glowed, bright, sickly yellow eyes, gleaming with an ancient, unfathomable hunger. It stopped just before him, its eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made Jake's skin crawl. There was no sound in the room, no air to breathe, just the weight of the creature's gaze pressing down on him, suffocating him. The figure's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, Jake felt the voice, no, the presence, enter his mind, curling around his thoughts like tendrils of darkness, twisting them, suffocating them. The voice was deep, guttural, as if it came from somewhere far beyond human comprehension. You are mine now. The words echoed through his skull, vibrating through his very bones, like a pulse from the heart of the earth. He could feel them, inside him, like poison, filling him with a cold, gnawing hunger that he couldn't escape. The Wendigo was inside him now, in every part of his body, feeding on his fear, on his confusion, on his very soul. You cannot escape. The figure's smile widened, a twisted, hungry grin that stretched too wide, its jagged teeth gleaming in the flickering light. The hunger in its eyes deepened, and Jake felt it too, that insatiable void, that hunger that had claimed him, that had claimed everything. It was here, inside him now, and there was no escape. Akitaz, the ritual. Jake's thoughts spiraled, his mind crashing against the wall of despair that was closing in around him. His body was no longer his own. The chains, the darkness, the Wendigo, they had taken him, and there was nothing left. No hope, no light, no escape. And then, as if in answer to his thoughts, the room shifted again. The stone floor beneath him trembled, and the chains rattled with a deafening noise. The darkness seemed to rise, swirling around him like a storm, filling the room with a choking, suffocating air. The figure, the Wendigo's presence, loomed closer, its eyes glowing brighter, its hunger filling the space around him. It is time. The words were a command, and Jake's body responded. His hands, his arms, his legs, they moved against his will, drawn toward the center of the room, toward the altar that had appeared in the darkness. It was a stone slab, large and jagged, covered in strange symbols that pulsed with an eerie light. The chains around his wrists seemed to pull him toward it, dragging him, forcing him into the center of the ritual. The Wendigo's presence was everywhere now, in the air, in the earth, in the very shadows that twisted around him. The hunger was overwhelming, a crushing weight that threatened to consume him whole. He could feel it deep inside him, clawing at his insides, gnawing at his thoughts, ripping apart everything he had ever known. And then, as if the very earth had opened up beneath him, Jake was thrown onto the altar. His body hit the stone with a sickening thud, his limbs jerking in unnatural angles. The chains around his wrists tightened, pulling him further into the stone, binding him to the altar as the darkness pressed down on him, suffocating him. The air grew cold, and the heartbeat returned, louder now, as if the very pulse of the earth had become one with his own. The whispers grew louder too, swirling around him like a storm, their words becoming clear. "It is time." The figure loomed above him, its eyes burning with an ancient fire, its smile widening impossibly. The Wendigo had come, and it was hungry. "You will become part of the hunger." Jake's chest tightened as the figure moved closer, its hands stretching toward him. The coldness of its touch seemed to freeze him to the bone, and as it reached out, he could feel his very soul being pulled toward the creature, toward the abyss. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, filling his body, filling his mind. And then, just as he thought he would be consumed by it all, the earth beneath him shook again, the stone of the altar cracking open, splitting down the middle. The world seemed to unravel, the ground falling away beneath him. The unseen realm. Jake's screams were swallowed by the darkness. His body felt weightless, as though he were falling through endless shadows, spiraling down into the depths of the abyss. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mind was consumed by the Wendigo's hunger, by the endless call of the void, pulling him deeper, further, until there was no more air to breathe, no more light to see. He had become part of it, part of the forest, part of the hunger. The world around him seemed to twist, to fold in on itself, until there was nothing but the endless abyss, the never-ending hunger that would consume everything, that would consume him. There was no end to it, no escape. He had been chosen, and in the darkness, in the silence, in the cold hunger, Jake finally understood. There was no leaving the Wendigo. There never had been. And the forest would go on, forever, its hunger eternal. Chapter 7. The Flesh and the Shadows. The darkness was an entity all its own. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the weight of something ancient and hungry. Jake's body, though battered and bruised from the ordeal in the altar chamber, was now a shell, a mere vessel for something far darker than any creature he had encountered before. The forest had claimed him. Its roots, its shadows, and the ever-present pulse of the Wendigo's hunger now intertwined with his very being. There was no escape, no refuge from the gnawing pull of the forest's will. His senses were distorted, twisted. He could feel the earth beneath him, yet it seemed to shift with every movement, the ground opening up like a living thing, swallowing him whole with every step. The trees around him towered higher than he remembered, their branches scraping the sky, their gnarled roots snaking across the ground in unnatural patterns. Their shadows seemed to stretch longer now, like the hands of the dead reaching out from the depths of the earth. Jake couldn't tell if he was moving in circles, lost in the shifting labyrinth of the forest, or if the forest itself had altered its geography to trap him. Every direction seemed to lead back to where he had started, the trees closing in behind him as if they were aware of his every move, mocking him. The whispers followed him, soft at first, like the murmur of 1,000 voices caught in the wind, but they grew clearer with every step. Each word was a plea, a demand, a prayer to the darkness. "Join us, Jake. It's too late to turn back." His thoughts were no longer his own. The Wendigo's presence was inside him, suffocating him, feeding on the remnants of his willpower, eroding his humanity with every passing moment. His legs moved mechanically, dragging him further into the heart of the forest, toward something, toward an end he didn't want to face, yet knew was inevitable. He could no longer remember why he had started this journey in the first place. The allure of Ted's journal, the mystery of the cave, had long since faded into a distant memory, replaced by a consuming hunger that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The forest was not just a place, it was alive. It was a force that had existed long before humanity, before light, before time, and now it wanted him. The calling. The pulse of the forest was everywhere. It was in the earth beneath his feet, in the wind that whispered through the branches, in the distant rustle of something moving beyond the edge of his sight. The air had grown colder, but it wasn't the chill of winter. It was the cold of something ancient, something that had seen the world before the first breath of man. The forest itself seemed to be exhaling, breathing in time with the heartbeat that filled his chest. Jake could feel it now, the shift, the subtle pull that had started so long ago in the cave. His mind drifted, his thoughts fragmented, and for a moment, he could almost hear Ted's voice in the distance, calling to him from beyond the veil. But when he tried to turn, to find the source, there was nothing. Only the deep shadows that enveloped him. "It's waiting for you, Jake." The voice was not Ted's. It was the Wendigo's, deep and hollow, vibrating with a hunger that seemed to resonate through the very air around him. It was everywhere now, filling every crack in his mind, every crevice in his soul. The hunger was not just a physical need. It was something deeper, something more primal. The further Jake walked, the more the forest seemed to consume him. His vision blurred, and the trees around him grew impossibly tall. Their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, like arms reaching out to grab him, to pull him into the shadows. The ground beneath him was uneven, shifting with each step, the earth opening up and swallowing the remnants of the path he had once followed. Suddenly, the whispering voices stopped. The world around him froze. It was then that he saw it. A shape, dark and indistinct, emerged from the shadows. At first it was only a faint outline, but as it stepped closer, it became clearer. A figure, tall and gaunt, its limbs long and twisted, its body impossibly thin. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, its every step an eerie dance that defied the natural order. Its face was a mask of shadows, hollow eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He knew this figure. It was the Wendigo, Frats of the Wendigo's embrace. The Wendigo's eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Jake felt the ground beneath him tremble, as though the very earth had become alive, pulsing in time with the creature's heartbeat. The forest around them seemed to bow to the Wendigo's presence, its branches twisting and writhing like living serpents, reaching toward him with gnarled fingers. The air became thick with the Wendigo's presence, its hunger filling the space between them like a fog, suffocating, relentless. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the creature slowly moved toward him, its skeletal body creaking with every step. "You've come so far, Jake," the Wendigo whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves, cold and distant. "But you can't escape. You never could." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as his legs refused to move. The Wendigo's gaze never wavered, its eyes pulling him closer, filling his mind with its hunger. The forest had claimed him long ago, and now the Wendigo would take him, consume him, just as it had done with Ted and the others who had dared to wander too deep. "You are one with us now," the Wendigo murmured, its voice growing deeper, more insistent. "You are part of the forest, part of the hunger." Jake tried to scream, to fight back, but his mouth was dry, his body paralyzed. The Wendigo's words echoed through his mind, vibrating in his skull, drowning out everything else. The hunger was inside him now, gnawing at his thoughts, consuming his will. There was no fight left in him. He was no longer Jake. He was part of it, part of the Wendigo, part of the forest that had swallowed him whole. The figure stepped closer, its long fingers reaching out, cold and twisted, like branches from the trees. It touched his face, and the moment its fingers made contact, a jolt of cold shot through Jake's body, freezing him from the inside out. The forest seemed to fold around him, closing in like a vice, and he felt himself being drawn into the Wendigo's darkness. "You will become part of the hunger," the Wendigo said, its voice now filling every corner of his mind. "You will never leave. The forest will always be with you." The spiral Jake's body jerked as if something deep within him had awakened. But it wasn't him. It wasn't Jake anymore. It was the Wendigo's hunger, rising up within him, swallowing him whole. He could feel the hunger consuming him, twisting his body, his soul, until nothing remained but the void, the endless, gnawing hunger that had always been there beneath the surface. His skin began to twist, his body stretching and contorting, as if the Wendigo's form was becoming his own. He could feel his bones elongating, his joints bending unnaturally, as if they were being reformed, reshaped to fit the hunger inside him. The pain was unbearable, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The forest had claimed him, and now it was changing him. As his body shifted, his mind shattered into 1,000 pieces, each one lost to the forest, to the Wendigo, to the hunger. He could hear the whispers now, not just in his mind, but from all around him, coming from the trees, the earth, the very air. The forest was alive, its pulse matching the beat of his heart. And in that moment, Jake understood. The Wendigo wasn't just a creature. It was the forest. It was the hunger that had existed long before humans, long before time itself. And now, Jake was part of it. He tried to scream, but the scream was swallowed by the darkness, by the Wendigo's presence. The forest was too strong, too hungry. He was nothing now, a part of the void, a whisper in the eternal night. Both Santuanuk, the forest's song. As Jake's form twisted and shifted into the Wendigo's shape, his body became something more, something less, trapped in a state of endless hunger. He felt the ground beneath him pulse, the very soil alive with the rhythm of the Wendigo's heartbeat, the eternal pulse of the forest's hunger. The forest was vast, ancient, and now Jake was part of it. He could feel it in the trees, in the roots that spread beneath the earth, in the shadows that clung to the branches. It was a part of him, and he was part of it. The Wendigo's eyes were no longer separate from his own. The hunger was all that remained, consuming him, devouring his thoughts, his memories. There was nothing left but the dark void, the endless cycle of hunger, and the forest that would never let him go. And in the silence, in the endless blackness of the forest, the whispers of those who had come before him filled the air, joining together in a mournful chorus. They were part of the forest now too. Lost, consumed by the hunger, trapped in the endless cycle of the Wendigo's call. Jake was no longer Jake. He was the hunger, the forest, and it was eternal. As the echoes of the voices faded into the distance, Jake, no, the Wendigo, stood alone, a shadow among the trees, waiting for the next soul to wander too deep into the forest, to hear the call, to be consumed by the darkness. The forest would never end, and neither would the hunger. Chapter 8. The Waking Void, rewritten and expanded. Jake's body was no longer his own. The moment the darkness consumed him, it had taken control of his every movement, his every thought. His body no longer obeyed his commands. He was nothing more than a vessel, a shell caught between the fading remnants of his humanity and the insatiable hunger that had taken root within him. The Wendigo had already claimed him, and now the forest itself was molding him into something else entirely, something ancient and unrecognizable. The forest had become a labyrinth. The path before him twisted and turned, but no matter how much he tried to navigate, the trees seemed to rearrange themselves, closing in on him, pushing him deeper into the heart of the woods. The darkness was a living thing now, pressing against him from all sides. It wrapped itself around his mind like an inescapable shroud, clouding his thoughts, drowning out every ounce of reason that remained within him. The forest was breathing. Jake could feel it, the deep, resonating hum in the ground beneath his feet, the way the trees seemed to pulse in rhythm with the beat of his own heart. The air around him was thick with the scent of decay, the stale smell of rot and earth. It wasn't just a forest, it was alive. Its hunger was insatiable, stretching out into the farthest corners of the world, devouring everything in its path. And now it had him. Everywhere he looked, shadows danced just beyond the reach of his vision. They swirled in the corners of his eyes, flickering and shifting like something watching him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, moving silently in the darkness, waiting for him. The wind had grown colder, carrying with it an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. It wasn't the cold of winter, it was the cold of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. As Jake continued to move, Each step seemed to bring him deeper into the abyss. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tightening with each inhalation. The hunger that had first been a gnawing sensation was now a relentless, gnawing ache deep within him, clawing at his very soul. The Wendigo had consumed his body, but the forest, it was consuming his mind. The whispers had returned. They were softer now, but unmistakable. They floated in the air around him like a gentle breeze, caressing his ears, pulling at his thoughts. But they were not kind whispers. They were the voice of the forest, the voice of the Wendigo, and they spoke of only one thing. Hunger, come closer. It's waiting for you. You're almost home. Jake couldn't tell if the voices were real or just a manifestation of his crumbling sanity. But they were there, insistent and relentless, pressing into his mind, urging him onward, deeper into the forest. He had no choice but to follow. Every step he took seemed to draw him further into their grasp. The shadows pressed closer around him, thicker now, as if the trees themselves were closing in. The hollow path. The forest was shifting around him, warping, bending in strange and unnatural ways. The trees grew taller, their trunks twisted and knotted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Their roots stretched far beneath the earth, as though they were part of some great ancient network, a web of darkness that spanned the entire world. The wind rustled through the leaves, but it wasn't the soft, comforting sound of nature. It was the rustle of something darker, something far older. It was the sound of the forest, and it was watching him. Jake's legs felt heavy, each step becoming more difficult. The pull of the forest was unbearable, as though the very earth beneath him was alive, tugging at him, dragging him towards something deeper, darker. The shadows clung to him, wrapping themselves around his body like a suffocating embrace. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there, those dark shapes moving just beyond the edge of his sight. They were watching him, waiting for him. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure, standing just ahead, barely visible in the deep shadows. The figure was tall, its form outlined by the faintest hint of moonlight. At first, Jake thought it might be a trick of the darkness, a figment of his imagination. But as he moved closer, the figure became clearer, more distinct. It was a man, or something that had once been a man. Its features were gaunt, its skin pale, stretched tight across its skull, and its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were locked onto him, staring at him with an intensity that sent chills down his spine. Jake's body froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he realized that he wasn't looking at a person at all. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent. It was Ted. The reflection. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight of Ted, or whatever had become of him. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Ted had been his guide, his only connection to this cursed place. But now, standing before him, he was no longer the man he had once known. Ted was a shadow, a reflection of something far darker. His body was emaciated, his skin cracked and pale, and his mouth hung open in a grotesque, empty grin. There was no life in his eyes, no recognition, just emptiness. Jake reached out, but his body refused to obey. It was as though his legs were stuck in place, held captive by the force that had claimed the forest, by the Wendigo's insatiable hunger. His heart raced in his chest, each beat louder than the last, but still, his body remained frozen. The whispers grew louder now, pressing against his mind, filling his thoughts with an overwhelming sense of dread. Ted's lips moved, but the sound that came from his mouth wasn't human. It was a rasping, gurgling noise, like something struggling to escape from deep within him. "You're too late, Jake. It's already inside you." Ted's voice rasped, his head tilting to the side in a motion far too unnatural. Jake staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest, but Ted's gaze never wavered. The words were like a cold slap to the face, sending shockwaves of fear through him. He had been so close. He had been so sure that he could escape this place, that he could still make it out. But now, standing before him, was the awful truth. Jake's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, any chance to run. But there was nowhere to go. The forest stretched endlessly before him, its dark tendrils wrapping around every exit. The hunger had already begun to consume him. He could feel it now, deep in his chest. The Wendigo's hunger, gnawing at his soul, erasing his very identity. Ted had been lost to it, and now, so was he. The forest had claimed him, and there was no turning back. As the ritual begins without warning, Ted's body jerked, his limbs contorting in unnatural angles, and Jake was forced to watch in horrified silence as the figure began to move, its movements slow at first, then growing more erratic, more frantic. Ted's body twisted and spasmed, his head snapping back in a way that defied human anatomy, his eyes now wide open, glowing with an eerie yellow light. The hunger was inside him, consuming him, and it was taking Jake with it. The shadows around them deepened, thickening until the entire clearing was bathed in darkness. The air grew heavier, suffocating, and the ground beneath them began to shift, cracking open in places, revealing something black and oily beneath the surface. The Wendigo had come. It's time, Ted's voice whispered, but it was not Ted speaking. It was the Wendigo. Its voice had overtaken his, its hunger seeping into every word. Jake's body trembled, his mind screaming to escape, but it was too late. The chains of hunger had already wrapped around him, pulling him forward. His legs moved of their own accord, dragging him toward the center of the clearing, toward the altar of darkness. He stumbled, falling to his knees, but the earth refused to release him. The ground clung to his flesh, its roots winding around him, pulling him closer, as if the forest itself had become a living, breathing thing. And then he saw it. The altar, carved from the black stone that rose from the ground like a monument to some ancient, forgotten god. The surface was slick with dark, viscous liquid, the same liquid that pooled beneath the earth, black as night, reflecting nothing. It wasn't just blood. It was the essence of the forest itself, the embodiment of the hunger that had consumed everything in its path. The heartbeat reverberated through the earth again, shaking the very air. The Wendigo's eyes fixed on Jake, and for a moment, the hunger was all he could see. It was not a creature, not a beast. It was the forest, the earth, the darkness that had always been there. The void. Join us, Jake. You will never leave. You will never be alone again. Ditos, once the void consumes Jake's body, was now part of it. The hunger consumed his every thought, eroded his very sense of self. The Wendigo, the forest, the altar. It was all one now, a living, breathing entity that had consumed him, body and soul. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were part of the forest, part of the hunger, part of the endless, eternal cycle that would never end. The Wendigo stepped closer, its form shifting with every movement, growing taller, darker, until it enveloped him completely. Its eyes burned with the intensity of the void, its presence filling every corner of his mind. It spoke, but not with words. It was in the very air, in the very ground beneath him. Jake's last thought before the darkness took him was not a scream, but a realization. He was not alone anymore. He never would be. The forest had claimed him, and it would never let him go. But the endless hunger, the darkness was eternal, swallowing everything, every thought, every trace of who Jake had once been. The Wendigo was everywhere now, its hunger filling the forest, filling the void. And Jake, or what was left of him, stood with the Wendigo, a part of the hunger, part of the endless, insatiable force that would never cease. The forest would go on, forever hungry, forever watching. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, another soul would wander too close, another would be claimed. The cycle never ended, the hunger never stopped, and the forest, the Wendigo, would always be there, waiting. Chapter 9. The Boundless Abyss. Jake's consciousness returned to him like a distant echo, slow and broken, as if he had been submerged underwater for far too long. His eyes fluttered open, but the world around him was nothing more than a blur of shadows, shapes, and oppressive darkness. The cold seeped into his bones, the dampness of the earth beneath him soaking through his clothes. His body was stiff, as if it had been there for an eternity, but the gnawing hunger within him screamed to be fed, to take him further into this nightmare. He tried to move, but his limbs were heavy, as if his very flesh had become weightless and bound to the ground. It felt as though something was pressing down on him, suffocating him from all sides. Every breath was a struggle, the air too thick, too dense. He felt the dark pulse of the forest around him, the heartbeat that filled every corner of his mind, every inch of his soul. It was inside him. He was already one with it. The hunger was overwhelming now. It wasn't just the craving for food or sustenance. It was deeper, more primal. It clawed at him from the inside, a hunger that could not be satisfied. It was the deep void that could never be filled. It was a hole in his chest, an eternal ache in his heart that spread through every fiber of his being. For a long moment, Jake's eyes stared into the darkness, trying to understand his surroundings. But everything was foreign. The forest, once so familiar in its eerie beauty, had changed. The shadows clung to him like wet cloth, creeping up his limbs, wrapping around him like invisible chains. The trees that once stood like silent sentinels now seemed twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing toward him like skeletal hands, trying to drag him deeper into the suffocating darkness. The air was dense with the smell of decay, earthy, musky, the stench of rot. And yet, beneath it all, there was something more, something sweet and nauseatingly familiar. The scent of death. Jake's fingers twitched, his hand instinctively brushing against the cold, slick surface beneath him. His hand met the earth, and the moment his palm touched the ground, he felt a shiver run through his entire body. The soil was not just damp, it was pulsing, alive. The forest had become sentient. The ground around him began to shift, the earth beneath him groaning and stretching, as if the very land was alive. It twisted in unnatural ways, the roots of the trees breaking through the soil like veins beneath the skin. The shadows deepened, swirling in front of his face, becoming more than just darkness. They became something solid, something tangible. It was as if the darkness had shape, a form that was meant to consume him. No, not just consume. A primal urge surged through Jake's chest, and he realized he was no longer alone. The air grew thicker, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. The whispers returned, louder this time, their voices distant yet clear, like a chorus of wind, a rustling of leaves, a faint murmur from the shadows. The voices circled him, growing closer with every breath. Come closer, it's waiting for you. You're already one with it. The hunger within him throbbed again, more insistent, and suddenly, Jake's body responded. His legs moved without his command, his feet dragging him forward, stumbling through the thick, cloying darkness. Every step he took brought him deeper into the forest, deeper into the heart of the abyss. He was no longer walking. He was being dragged, pulled, carried towards something he couldn't escape. His eyes fell to the ground, and as he moved, he saw the black substance that covered the earth, swirling around him like oil. It was slick and dark, and it felt alive, as if it were breathing, pulsing beneath his feet. The hunger had made the earth itself a prison, and Jake was its prisoner. The path ahead of him grew darker still, the air growing colder, the trees bending as if to block out the very light of the moon. There was nothing but shadows ahead, twisting and growing in unnatural ways. The hunger inside him was alive, feeding off the darkness, urging him forward. He could feel it, deep in his bones. He was being guided, but to where? The question lingered, but his mind was too fogged, too consumed with the need to find an answer. Then, out of the thickening fog, something emerged. Something that wasn't a tree, something that wasn't part of the forest. A figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, standing still and silent among the twisting branches, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Jake's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't human. He didn't know what it was, but it wasn't human. It was something far older, far more ancient. The figure seemed to merge with the shadows themselves, its form indistinct, like a black silhouette against the night. No, Jake's body froze. He knew this thing, the shape, the presence. It was the Wendigo. The Wendigo's call. The Wendigo's eyes locked onto Jake's, and in that moment time seemed to freeze. The hunger that had been gnawing at him, tugging at his every thought, suddenly grew louder, more urgent, filling his mind with nothing but an overwhelming need. The Wendigo's presence was suffocating. More than just a beast, more than just a creature. It was the embodiment of the forest's hunger, the manifestation of its eternal void. Jake could feel it now. The tendrils of the Wendigo's hunger wrapping around his mind, curling inside his chest like an invasive vine, choking him. The air around him grew colder still, the shadows deeper, as if the Wendigo itself was pulling the very essence of light from the world. The Wendigo took a step forward, its long limbs stretching in unnatural ways. Its mouth, impossibly wide, opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, dripping with a black liquid that seemed to pulse in time with the forest's heartbeat. Its voice, when it spoke, was not a voice at all. It was an echo, a vibration, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the ground, through Jake's bones. "You belong to us now." The words came not as sound, but as thought, as a pressure on his mind, as if the Wendigo was reaching inside him, claiming him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. The hunger inside Jake flared, burning through his veins, his mind spiraling as it fed on the darkness around him. He could feel it, feel the Wendigo's presence growing stronger, its hunger swelling with each passing moment. It was feeding on him, consuming him, making him one with the forest. And then, in the distance, Jake saw something else, a light. It flickered, barely visible, like a star shining through the oppressive darkness. His heart skipped a beat. Was it hope? Was it an escape? But as he moved toward it, the light began to fade, slowly, like a dying ember in the wind. The forest pressed in, the shadows curling around the flickering light, swallowing it whole. "You cannot escape." Jake's breath hitched, and he turned back to face the Wendigo, now standing inches from him, its yellow eyes burning with an insatiable fire. He tried to move, to run, but his body was no longer his own. It moved against his will, stumbling forward, toward the Wendigo, toward the hunger. The Wendigo's grin widened, and Jake felt himself being drawn into it, into the very core of the forest, into the beating heart of the Wendigo's endless hunger. Mas the abyss. Revealed, the air grew thick, suffocating, as Jake stumbled forward, his limbs heavy, his mind lost to the hunger. He was no longer himself. The forest had claimed him, the Wendigo had claimed him. And now, he was part of it. Part of the endless, insatiable hunger that would never stop, never cease. He was led deeper into the heart of the forest, into the center of the abyss, where the trees twisted together to form a thick black wall, blocking out the moon and the stars. The ground beneath him was soft, wet with the black oil that swirled around him like a living thing. And then, in the center of the clearing, Jake saw it, a massive stone circle, ancient and weathered, its surface covered in dark symbols. The symbols seemed to shift, glowing faintly as though they were alive, pulsing with an energy that Jake could not understand. The Wendigo stopped in front of the altar, its hollow eyes turning toward him, its grin widening impossibly. "Welcome home, Jake. Welcome to the forest." The hunger was overwhelming now, a torrent of pure desire that filled every part of him. His body was no longer his own. His thoughts were no longer his own. The Wendigo's presence filled him, consumed him, until there was nothing left but the dark, endless hunger. And as the Wendigo stepped forward, its hands reaching for him, Jake realized the truth. There was no escape from the Wendigo. There never had been. The Wendigo had claimed him. And now, the end of the path. The darkness closed in around Jake, swallowing him whole. The hunger, the Wendigo, the forest, it all consumed him, devouring his soul, erasing everything he had ever been. The last flicker of light was snuffed out, and in the vast silence, the heartbeat of the Wendigo filled the void. And there, in the heart of the forest, where the hunger never ceased, Jake was no more. Only the forest remained, and the hunger, eternal. Chapter 10. The Hollow Depths. Jake's mind floated in a dark, oppressive void, a never-ending descent into madness. Every part of him felt heavy, weighted, as though the very air he breathed had become thicker, suffocating him from within. His body seemed to be a shell, hollow and devoid of meaning, as though it no longer belonged to him. The earth beneath him was cold, slick with an ancient, viscous substance that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. His hands, trembling with an unnatural chill, dug into the soil, the sensation crawling beneath his skin like an infection. His breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. The hunger, an insatiable, gnawing emptiness, had taken hold of him completely. It was inside him, inside his very bones, coursing through his veins like a poison. The hunger wasn't just physical anymore. It was something deeper, a primal force that consumed everything it touched. The Wendigo's presence, that dark force that had been a whisper in the back of his mind, was now an undeniable reality, suffocating him with its weight. "You are one of us now." The words were not spoken aloud. They came from within, crawling through his consciousness like a dark thought that infected his very being. The Wendigo's hunger, its endless craving, had become his own. The forest, with its twisted roots and creeping shadows, had claimed him. The trees above him groaned, their gnarled limbs stretching into the sky like skeletal fingers. Their roots dug deep into the ground, pulling at the earth, wrapping around him like chains. The entire forest seemed to be alive, pulsing in time with the insatiable hunger that roared through him. The shadows of the trees were no longer mere darkness. They moved, they breathed, they lived. They were watching him, waiting for him. Jake's body moved against his will, dragged forward by an invisible force. His legs were unsteady, his feet slipping in the muck that clung to the ground, but he could not stop. He could feel the Wendigo's presence guiding him, pulling him towards something far darker, far more ancient than anything he could understand. He could feel it in the air, a cold, suffocating pressure that threatened to crush him.